Shalom, everybody. James Trim here, and today I want to speak with you about something I call Hebraic Stoicism. This is actually lesson one in what will be a whole series of lessons on the subject. Now, Hebraic Stoicism, let's begin with, by its very nature is actually known as a Greek philosophy, one of the major Greek philosophies. You have Epicureanism, Stoicism, and Cynicism. Okay. As a Greek philosophy, Stoicism is actually from the Greek word stoic, refers to the porches on which the ancient Greeks would discuss and debate physics. Physics was part of it, philosophy. As a Greek philosophy, Stoicism was said to be founded by a man named Zenos, and Zenos based his premises upon earlier Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Timaeus, and so on. And to summarize the premise and the basis of Stoicism, the premise on which the logic of Stoicism is built is that there's an active cause, a rational intelligence called the Logos, that infused the universe with a rational purpose known as providence, and that living in accordance with that natural law is the path to harmony with the universe. Achieving harmony with that rational mind means adopting rational thinking ourselves, and thus aligning our thinking with that of the Logos, the rational mind infusing the universe. Now, we have a whole series of handouts here that is a PDF file with this video teaching, and I encourage you to print them out and have them ready to go through. The first one is labeled Eros Nobilis. So, what is Hebraic Stoicism? Well, Hebraic Stoicism is a term I like to use that I've coined for the brand of Jewish Stoicism that existed at least as early as the time of the Maccabees, if not back to Moses, as the Jewish Stoics themselves would have argued, and as we will present some of their arguments here, and at least as late as the rabbinic sage known as Ben Zoma. One may be able to point some later rabbinic sages, I don't know. But Ben Zoma was clearly a Jewish Stoic. Now, I use the term Hebraic Stoicism today instead of Jewish Stoicism because if I use the term Jewish Stoicism, people will just think it's some kind of a Jewish thing. And it is, but it's not just for Jews. It's for anyone with a appreciation for the ancient Hebrew peoples, the ancient Jews, which is the root of both the Judaism and, the Judeo-Christian faiths. Okay. Arguably Abrahamic faiths too, but certainly Judeo-Christian faiths. So that said, it's demonstrable that there was a Jewish Stoicism that was the philosophy of many Hellenistic Jews that lived, and even perhaps pre-Hellenistic Jews, but it was certainly prevalent amongst the Hellenistic Jews of Alexandria. Now, unfortunately, the Alexandrian Jewish community was destroyed around 116 CE, that does overlap. Actually, Philo's lifetime overlaps with that of Benzoma. And that community was destroyed, and their philosophy lost. This is not the Hellenist philosophy, or this is not the Hellenism that the Maccabees were fighting. It was not pagan by any means. In fact, Philo of Alexandria was Torah observant and emphasized the importance of observing Torah. So let's talk about Aristobulus. In fact, Aristobulus is one of the reasons that we know that this is not the Hellenism that was being fought by the Maccabees, because Judas Maccabee, Second Maccabees, the book of Second Maccabees actually is prefaced with a letter that was written from Judas Maccabee to Aristobulus, encouraging the Jews in Egypt to observe the Feast of Hanukkah and explaining its background. And this letter from Judas Maccabee to Aristobulus, Aristobulus was the leader of the Jewish community in the 2nd century BCE, around the time of Judas Maccabee and the events that we read in the books of the Maccabees. And surely Judas Maccabee wasn't writing to the Hellenist Jews of Alexandria to try and get them to celebrate the feast of his defeating them. It was not the same sort of Hellenism, if you will. In fact, I would even venture to say many of them didn't consider themselves Hellenistic necessarily at all. So Aristobulus, then, the reason I bring him up also is that, as I said, these ancient Jewish Stoics, of which I believe Stephen in the book of Acts was one, these ancient Jewish Stoics did not see their Stoicism and their philosophy as actually deriving from the Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, etc. To the contrary, they saw their philosophy as arising from the Tanakh. Benzoma, when he gives his 4 basic teachings in the Mishnah, in Tractate of Vote 4:1, I believe it is, he cites a scripture for each one of them. Philo, as we will see, derives his ideas. He says he derives them from Moses, and often he cites the texts and shows you how he derives them from Moses if we are careful to actually see what he's saying. So Aristobulus wrote in Fragment 3, which is quoted in Eusebius, Book 12, Chapter 12, starting in Section 1. It is evident, he writes, it is evident that Plato imitated our Torah, and that he had investigated thoroughly each of the elements in it. For it had been translated by others before Demetrius Phaleris, before the conquests of Alexander and the Persians. So he's saying that even before the Septuagint, there were informal Greek translations of the Tanakh circulating around amongst the Greeks. In Fragment 4, which is quoted in Eusebius, Book 13, Chapter 13, Section 4, Aristobulus writes, "And it seems to me that Pythagoras, Socrates, and Plato, with great care, follow him," speaking of Moses, "in all respects. They copy him when they say that they hear the voice of God, and they contemplate the arrangements of the universe, so carefully made and so unceasingly held together by God." So Aristobulus says, look, Socrates, Plato, Pythagoras, so on, they got their ideas from Moses. Now, Aristobulus doesn't tell us any more. Of course, we don't have a lot of Aristobulus' actual writings. Even those fragments are taken from fragments that are quoted by later writers. So I want to move on now to Philo, and I want to show how the foundational precepts and premises on which the philosophy known as Stoicism is built can be and are derived by Philo from the Torah and also from other parts of the Tanakh, but primarily the Torah. And there's so much I can teach on this and so much to present. We'll be doing more lessons. I won't be covering everything that I could cover on some of the subjects that I'm going to cover today. I'm just going to be really laying the foundation. And also, Philo's works are filled with precepts of Stoicism, although he refers to Stoics in the second person as if he's not one. Certainly, when you read his writings, he clearly has a philosophy that can only be identified as Stoicism. And particularly, especially of interest is his book On Creation, and we may do a lesson going through On Creation in the future. However, we'll just be right now building the foundation of how you get Stoicism from the Tanakh and how you get the very foundational basis for Stoicism in the Tanakh. There's so much more than we'll be covering, like I said. So I want to turn to On Creation, Philo, On Creation, 7 through 9, section 7 through 9 of On Creation. And I'm not going to present Philo's arguments necessarily in order, because in his book On Creation, he presents his conclusion first, and then he goes and he shows in the after that, he then shows how he builds the conclusion. Instead, I'm going to show how he builds the conclusion, and then we'll come back to the beginning of On Creation and show the conclusion that he was justifying. So we're going to go in reverse order from what Philo does. Philo starts with his conclusion, and he says, now let me show you how I get there. We're going to start by following his logic, and then we'll come back and get to the conclusion. All right. So our next handout says first cause at the top, and it's got a line of Hebrew, and you don't have to be able to use Hebrew to understand this. I'm going to break it down so that anyone can understand it. This Hebrew across the top here is the very first line of the Torah, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. And it says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim va'et haaretz. Now that doesn't mean anything unless you know Hebrew. So I'm going to explain it to you. There's 7 words here. The very first word, and Hebrew reads right to left, so the opposite of what you normally read in English. Starting on the right side of this line, the first word is Bereshit. Now the first letter is Beit, and that first letter is actually a prefix that means in, on, or at. And then the word is Rashit, which comes from the word Rosh, which means head, and Bereshit means, well, it's traditionally translated in the beginning. The rabbinical commentators debate on exactly what it means, whether it means in the beginning or because of its grammatical form, if it means at the start or at the beginning, or when Elohim began to create, going to some of the other words that we'll get in here. At the beginning of, it really is what it sort of means literally. What's key for us here is not really all of those arguments, but that the word indicates that there was a beginning. however you take it. And Philo actually, we won't cover it here, but Philo actually agrees with the rabbis to the extent that he says, look, this time wasn't created yet, so in the beginning doesn't necessarily mean the beginning of time, in that he's not sure that time necessarily even existed at this point, because he's thinking, well, in Philo's thinking, the universe is only being created conceptually here. You'll see what I'm talking about as we go along. But that it describes the order of things. And of course, that fits very much in with our concept of time today, and the chain of cause and effect, and the order of events, and what we call the direction of time in terms of entropy, and that chain of cause and effect, and the increase of entropy that takes place along the way. Okay. Keep my whistler wet here. The next word is the verb bara, created. The next word is, or to create. The next word is Elohim. We usually translate God, Elohim. Et is a word that does not translate into any other language. It's a very unique Hebrew word, and it's very, very important to what Philo is going to be saying here. Now, I have to kind of parenthetically say here that traditionally scholars don't believe Philo knew Hebrew. I don't know if he knew Hebrew or not. I think that the argument that he's presented here is so clearly tied to the Hebrew, and then we'll see other things that he says are so clearly tied to the Hebrew that if he didn't know any Hebrew at all, that he's presenting arguments that originated from his predecessors who knew Hebrew and taught him. Okay, so this word et is a word that does not translate into English. It doesn't even translate into Aramaic. It doesn't translate into Greek. It is a word that is unique to Hebrew. It's made up, incidentally, of the first and last Hebrew letters, Aleph and Tav. And it points to the next word as receiving the action of the verb. So it points to a direct object. So the next word is receiving the action of our verb. The next word is Hashemayim, the heavens, which is always plural in Hebrew, the heavens, Hashemayim. And then the next word, the first letter of it, va, that is and, a prefix meaning and then the word is et again. Pointing to the next word is also receiving the action. The next word is haaretz, the land. So we have the heavens and the earth are receiving the action of the verb grammatically in the Hebrew, because this word it is used twice, each time indicating that the word after it is receiving the action from the verb, which is bara, create, and the subject Elohim. And this is in reference to the beginning. All right. Now that we understand that, this is traditionally translated in the beginning Elohim, or in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. So now let's look at what Philo says in his book On Creation, sections 7 through 9. He says, for some men, admiring the world itself rather than the creator of the world, have represented it as existing without any make. That first line, for some men admiring the world itself rather than the creator of the world, actually reaches to things that are written in a book called The Wisdom of Solomon. Have represented it as existing without any maker and eternal. Aristotle, for example, said that that was his position. Plato had the position that it was not at a beginning. And Philo is saying Moshe was with Plato. Moshe said it had a beginning, because the word better it's in the beginning, or at the beginning, or when he began. It doesn't matter, there's a beginning. And it is impious as falsely have represented God as existing in a state of complete inactivity. While it would, okay, why does he say this? While it would, well, the reason he says this, it's twofold. One, in Timaeus, in Plato's Timaeus, Timaeus presents the idea that you have two kinds of things. They're the eternal and the non-eternal. Well, those things that are, what he says, exist, and those things which are becoming or changing. Okay. Those things which are becoming, he says, are not eternal, because they're changing. And we'll get to why they're not eternal here in a minute. But those things which are eternal then are not changing. They are always static, the same. While it would have been right, on the other hand, to marvel at the might of Elohim, or of God, as the creator and father of all, and to admire the world in a degree not exceeding the bounds of moderation. But Moses, who had early reached the very summits of philosophy, and who had learnt from the oracles of God the most numerous and important of the principles of nature, was well aware that it is indispensable that in all existing things there must be an active cause and a passive subject, and that the active cause is the intellect of the universe, thoroughly unadulterated and thoroughly unmixed, superior to virtue, superior to science, and superior even to abstract good or abstract beauty. While the passive subject is something inanimate and incapable of motion by any intrinsic power of its own, but having been set in motion and fashioned and endowed with life by the intellect, became transformed into the most perfect work, this world. And those who describe it as being uncreated do, without being aware of it, cut off the most useful and necessary of all the qualities which tend to produce piety, namely providence. So let's talk about some of the ideas that he's presented here and what he's trying to say. What Philo is saying, and he gets these ideas, well, I won't say he gets these ideas from Moses, but these ideas are also found in Timaeus, and he's drawing the two together in Plato's Timaeus. And that is that in the universe, we see processes, change, things are happening, okay? Verbs, okay? Stuff happens. And the stuff that happens in the universe are processes, and they're all a cause and effect, cause and effect. And it's a chain of cause and effect. And you can take every cause of an effect, and you take that cause, and it was also the effect of a previous cause, and so on and so forth. All the motion and activity of the universe can be traced through this chain of cause and effect, active cause upon a passive subject, until you ultimately, if it's eternal, it goes on forever. But if there is a beginning, and it can't be eternal because of this, basically, is the argument. But even further, there must therefore be a first cause. And that first cause then started the universe, if you will, started all these processes that take place in the universe. And because a cause is always greater than its effect, no effect is greater than its cause. Something is always lost in the process. We call that entropy, by the way. Second law of thermodynamics in modern physics. So since that active cause must be greater than the effect, the universe, That's why he says that it's thoroughly unadulterated, thoroughly unmixed, superior to virtue, and superior to science, superior even to abstract good or abstract beauty. In other words, superior to everything in the universe. Now, Philo, if we look at Genesis 1:1, which is what he is commenting upon here in this part of On Creation, is actually drawing these ideas from the Hebrew text up at the very top of this handout, from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Bereshit tells us that there's a beginning. Bara is the verb. Elohim is the active cause and the intellect of the universe. Et tells us that there's a cause and effect. That's what et is. It's a statement of cause and effect, that the next word receives the action. In other words, Elohim is the active cause, and that which became the heavens and the earth, according to this word et, is the passive object that upon which the active cause acted to create the universe. So what Philo is saying here is, that's why he says in section 8 says, but Moses. It doesn't say Philo. I'm sorry, Philo. He doesn't say Plato. He doesn't say but Plato. He ascribes his ideas here to Moses. He's not saying that this is in Plato's Timaeus, though it is. He's saying Moses said this, because in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, Moses says that there is a intellect of the universe that's an active cause acting upon a passive subject at the beginning that tells us that the universe had a beginning. Okay. Let's turn to our next handout. It's titled Two Worlds. We'll do another teaching on this at some point, another lesson on this, because this idea of Philo that talks about two worlds, that parallels Plato's idea of two worlds, is actually the ultimate source for the concept of four worlds in Kabbalah, which are derived from this. So I'm going to, instead of quoting Genesis at the top here, we have Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 27, which are the basis for what Philo is going to teach here and what Philo is deriving from the Torah, from Moshe. Moshe is Hebrew for Moses, by the way, for those that don't know. Genesis 1, 26 through 27, and Elohim said, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. Verse 27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, or the image of Elohim, created he him, male and female created he them. So On Creation, sections 15 through 19, Philo writes the following. We must mention as much as we can of the matters contained in this account, talking about the creation account in the Torah, since to enumerate them all is impossible, for he embraces that beautiful world which is perceptible only by the intellect, as the account of the first day will show. For God, as apprehending beforehand, as a God must do, that there could not exist a good imitation without a good model. Now, this is exactly what Timaeus says in Plato's Timaeus. But Philo's not getting this from Timaeus. He may be aware, he's certainly aware of Plato's Timaeus, but Philo is very clear that this is Moses' teaching. This is the Torah. He goes on to say, that there could not exist a good imitation without a good model, and that the things perceptible to the external senses, nothing could be faultless which was not fashioned with reference to some archetypal idea conceived by the intellect. When he had determined to create this visible world, previously formed that one which is perceptible only by the intellect, in order that so doing an incorporeal model formed as far as possible on the image of God. Genesis 1:27. He might then make this corporal world a younger likeness of the elder creation, which should embrace as many different genera perceptible to the external senses as the other world contains, and those which are visible only to the intellect. So in other words, on creation, Philo argues that when the creation took place, there were two stages of the creation, or more, at least two stages. And these two stages involved the first stage was the conceptual creation. That before Elohim created the world that we see around us, that we interact with, that we see, we hear, we touch, we smell, we taste, we interact with through our senses, this tangible physical universe in which we live, that he first imagined or created the universe in the mind of Elohim, and that the universe in the mind of Elohim is perceptible only to the intellect. In other words, we can't see it, we can't hear it, we can only think about it, we can understand it. We can comprehend that universe, but it's invisible. It's not. We don't interact with it with our senses. We can't touch it, and so on. So it basically derives that there are two worlds, and that world that was the world that was conceptual in Elohim, when Elohim planned to create the universe in the mind of Elohim, that is the model from which our creation was made. And that model, that is why it says here in the Torah that God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he them. And Philo's point, as we will see as we continue through some of his material here and elsewhere, is that the whole universe was created like that, not just man. But that world, which consists of ideas, in other words, the idea of a universe instead of the physical universe, it were impious in any degree to attempt to describe or even to imagine. But how it was created we shall know if we take it for our guide a certain image of the things which exist among us. When any city is founded through the exceeding ambition of some king or leader who lays claim to the absolute authority, and at the same time a man of brilliant imagination, eager to display his good fortune, then it happens at times that some man coming up who from his education is skillful in architecture, and he seeing the advantageous character and beauty of the situation, first of all sketches out in his own mind nearly all the parts of the city which is about to be completed. Then he sketches out in his own the temples, the gymnasia, the prytania and the markets, the harbor, the docks, the streets, the arrangement of the walls, the situation of the dwelling houses, and of the public and other buildings. Then, having received in his own mind, as on a waxen tablet, we'll revisit that in a minute, as on a waxen tablet, the form of each building, he carries in his heart the image of a city, perceptible as yet only by the intellect. The images of which he stirs up in memory, which is innate in him, and still further engraving them in his mind, like a good workman keeping his eyes fixed on his model, he begins to raise the city of stones and wood, making the corporal substances to resemble each of the incorporeal ideas. Now, we must form a somewhat similar opinion about God. of God, who, having determined to found a mighty state, first of all conceived its form in his mind, according to which form he made a world perceptible only by the intellect, and then completed one visible to the external senses, using the first one as a model. Verse 20, section 20. Philo is not writing scripture here. So section 20 of On Creation continues. As therefore the city, then previously shadowed out in the mind of the man of architectural skill, had no external place, but was stamped. I want you to remember that word, stamped. It's important. Stamped solely in the mind of the workman. So in the same manner, neither can the world which existed in ideas have any other local position except the divine reason. The Greek word here is logos, the word. Logos is an important word in Stoicism. It's also an important word in the New Testament. The Hebrew word is davar. We'll talk about this word here later. Which made them. For what other place could there be for his powers which should be able to receive and contain? I do not say all, but even any single one of them, whatever in its simple form, and the power and faculty which could be capable of creating the world, has for its origin and good which is founded on truth. For if anyone were desirous to investigate the cause on account for which the universe was created, I think he would come to no erroneous conclusion if he were to say, as one of the ancients did say, that the Father and Creator was good, on which account he did not grudge the substance a sharing of his own excellent nature, since it had nothing good of itself, but was able to become everything. This is actually a quote from Timaeus and Plato's Timaeus. For the substance was of itself destitute of arrangement, of quality, of animation, of distinctive character, and full of all disorder and confusion, and it received a change and transformation to what is opposite to this condition, and most excellent, and being invested with order, quality, animation, resemblance, identity, arrangement, harmony, and everything which belongs to the more excellent idea. I want you to remember from this, by the way, that it talked about this creation being engraved in a waxen tablet and stamped in the mind of the Creator. So I put a little chart here on the handout, active cause and passive object. The active cause, according to Philo, the intellect of the universe, form conceived in the mind of God, perceptible only to intellect, consists of ideas, incorporeal model, formed as far as possible on the image of God. The passive object is inanimate, incapable of motion, by intrinsic power of its own, became this world, perceptible to external senses in the corporeal world. I also want us to look here now further in Philo on creation, sections 129 through 130. He's going to be commenting here on this passage from Genesis in the Torah, Genesis 2:5, and every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. So here he says that Elohim created every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and he created every herb of the field before it grew. And Philo is going to tell us what he thinks that means, what idea he draws from that. So, section 129, he says, so Moses, again, Moses, not Plato. So Moses, summing up his account of the creation of the world, says in a brief style, this is the book of the creation of the heaven and the earth, when it took place in the day on which God made the heavens and the earth. And every green herb, he's quoting this Genesis 2:5, every green herb before it appeared on the earth, and all the grass of the field before it sprang up. Does he not here manifestly set before us incorporeal ideas perceptible only by the intellect, which have been appointed to be as seals of the perfected work? Don't forget that word seals, of the perfected works perceptible by the outward senses. For before the earth was green, he says, that this same thing, verdure, existed in the nature of things, and before the grass sprang out of the field, there was grass, though it was not visible. And we must understand in the case of everything else which is decided on by the external senses, in other words, it's not just the grass and the trees and the herbs, it was everything that God created. This is just examples. There were elder forms and motions previously existing, according to which the things which were created were fashioned and measured out. For although Moses did not describe everything collectively, in other words, he didn't tell us this about everything, but it goes for everything. He was just giving examples in Genesis 2:5. But only a part of what existed, as he was desirous of brevity. Beyond all men that ever wrote, still the few things which he has mentioned are examples of the nature of all. For nature perfects none of those which are perceptible to the outward senses without an incorporeal model. So Philo is telling us that Genesis 2:5, when it says that Elohim created every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and he created every herb of the field before it grew, means that he created them conceptually in his plan before he created them physically in the corporal world. Okay. Now I want to get to why that word stamp was important, why it was important about the idea of the waxen tablets, which we'll get to. Well, it was important that he talks about the creation being stamped in the mind of Elohim. And while this terminology and the seal that was mentioned, that I said, hey, remember that? Talk about the creation as a seal. Okay, so our next handout is creation is an impression. Now, Philo doesn't cite these verses, and as I said, the common wisdom is that Philo didn't know Hebrew, and yet it's very clear that in what Philo has to say, the Hebrew is the Hebrew understanding of the Hebrew words that are used in the Tanakh are in the background. And either Philo knew them and the scholars are wrong, or Philo didn't know them, but he's repeating things that he has learned from his mentors and teachers before him, and they knew the Hebrew. So I want to talk about a couple of Hebrew words here. The first word is Strong's number 2883, 2883. That's tava. Tava is a verb root in Hebrew. It occurs in biblical Hebrew. It means to sink in, to press in, to make an impression. Ideally, for example, like a seal in wax, like you melt the wax on the letter and you put the seal on it. Okay, that kind of making an impression. Okay. It's important because remember Philo talked about the universe, the world being created like on a waxen like the architect does. It does it on a waxen tablet first, and then in the real world. And then he talks about being stamped in the mind of Elohim, and he talks about the universe being a seal. So in Job chapter 38, verse 6, and I'm going to read the King James Version here, which is not especially helpful. But it says, whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened, talking about the creation of the world, or who laid the cornerstone thereof. Now, the word for fastened there is tava, to make an impression. In fact, some translations will say, whereupon are the foundations thereof sunk in. And some see in that the image of maybe like pillars being sunk in. Like you sink posts into the ground or pillars into the ground. But another image that you can have here is that the foundations of the universe were sunk in or impressed like the wax impression, like the seal on wax. Very important image. Proverbs 8:25. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills was I brought forth. Now the word settled is tava again, meaning to make an impression. Some will say before the mountains were sunk in. So the mountains and then the foundations of the universe are described, their creation is described as a process of impression, a process of stamping, a process like you stamp the wax seal or impress the wax seal. Okay? Now, this is important to Philo, not only because Philo is going to comment about this idea a lot here, but we've already saw that Philo talked about the universe being stamped. He talked about the universe being inscribed in a wax tablet, and he talked about the universe in terms of the creation in terms of a seal. He's also going to talk about nature here in a little bit, and that's also going to be important because there's a related Hebrew word that's spelled the same way without vowels. Ancient written Hebrew was without vowels, but it's pronounced teva instead of tava. Teva means nature or reputation. It's the word for natural. In fact, a derivative of it is where you get the word natural or natural laws and so on, based upon this same word that means to make an impression, because it is the idea, this word teva, nature of the universe, is the idea that the creator made an impression on the universe. His will, his intent was impressed upon this universe. And that impression of his will, his intent for the universe, the physical laws and so on, are nature. Now that word teva doesn't show up in biblical Hebrew, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The oldest documents, the earliest, I've got a dictionary of Mishnaic Hebrew that has that word in it, so I'm sure that word must appear in Mishnaic Hebrew somewhere. But it appears in a later time period for the first time. But that doesn't mean the word didn't exist in biblical times. It just means that the documents that we have in the Bible used that word. Philo clearly is aware of it, or his predecessors are aware of it. So let's talk about Philo back on Creation, section 6. He says, but the smallest seal, talking about the creation, he says the smallest seal receives imitations of things of colossal magnitude when engraved upon it. So perchance in some instances the exceeding beauty of the description of the creation of the world is recorded in the Torah, overshadowing with its brilliancy the souls of those who happen to meet it, will be delivered to a more concise record after these facts and verse premised, which it would be proper to pass over, not be proper to pass over in silence. Okay. I don't want us to repeat on Creation 15 through 19. We already read that. It is here on the handout, but I think it's here that he talks about the world being the architect laying out the city in a waxen tablet, like on in wax, before the actual creation. Okay. So this active cause acting on the passive object of the universe when the creation took place can be understood as one of analogous to a seal in making an impression in wax and leaving an impression of the creator of the rational mind of the creator in the universe, which is why the universe is a rational place that follows rational laws. Okay, and the intent of the creator then is embedded in the universe as a result of this. And this is what the Tanakh is teaching. Of course, these are the ideas of Stoicism. But Philo is saying that you don't need, these ideas don't have to come from Plato. They don't have to come from Timaeus and Plato and Xenos. They're right here in the Torah, and Moses was before any of these men. And if, this is why Eros Nobilis thought that, and perhaps quite correctly, that the true origin of these ideas was from the Torah in the first place. All right, so let's talk about the Logos. It's so important to Stoics. The Logos, the word in Greek. Psalm 33:6 describes the creation this way. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, or by the word of Yahweh were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. The word for word there in the Hebrew is davar. That's the Hebrew word for word. I won't even be scratching the surface on the significance of the concept of the word, which is davar in Hebrew, memra in the Aramaic of the Targums, and logos in the Greek of Philo, in the Greek New Testament, and in the Greek of the Stoic philosophers. Okay, so the idea that the logos is the origin of the universe, or that the word is the origin of the universe, is in Psalm 33:6. Don't have to get it from the Stoics or from the Greek philosophers. Let me put it that way. Now let's look at Wisdom of Solomon. Now we'll do a whole thing about Wisdom of Solomon in another lesson sometime. There's a good argument to be made. The traditional wisdom is that the Wisdom of Solomon is a later Greek work, but in fact there's a good argument to be made that the Wisdom of Solomon really was written by Solomon and really was written originally in Hebrew. We're not getting into that right now, but I am going to cite it. The Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 9, verses 1 through 2. I'm reading the Revised Standard Version. By the way, this is a handout. The word permeates the universe. O God of my fathers and Lord of mercy, who has made all things by your word, the Logos, and by your wisdom have formed man to have dominion over the creatures that you have made. So here, wisdom and the word are synonymous. And then in chapter 1, verses 6 through 7, I wanted to cite that first, chapter 9 first, to align word and wisdom. For wisdom is a kindly spirit, and we know from elsewhere now that it's the word, will not free a blasphemer from the guilt of his words, because God is witness of his innermost feelings, and true observer of his heart, and a hearer of his tongue. And then verse 7 is key here, because the Spirit of the Lord has filled the world. And that which holds all things together knows what is said. So here we have the wisdom, or the Logos, the word, described as filling the world and holding all things together, which is the same language that we see used by the Stoics. the Greek philosophers. So Philo says this in his book, Who is Heir of All Things, section 188. He says, for all things are intrinsically and by their own nature loose. And if there is any where anything consolidation that has been bound by the word of God, i.e. the Logos, for this word, this Logos, is glue and a chain, filling all things with its essence, and the word, the Logos, which connects together and fastens everything, is peculiarly full of itself, having no need whatever of anything beyond. This is what he says about the word. I think this is where maybe George Lucas got in the Star Wars, described the force as binding the universe together, binding everything together. The Logos fills all things and binds them together. Why? Because the active cause was the intellect of the universe, was a rational mind, and that rational mind was the Logos. Logos is where we get the word logic. And Devar, when we do a deeper study on this, we'll find that the Hebrew word Devar is tied to reasoning and logic. And that's why he also identifies it here with wisdom in Wisdom of Solomon. Permeates the universe, fills the universe, and binds it together because it's embedded in the universe with the intent of the rational mind of the universe, the creator. All right, Philo, again, in his book Concerning Noah's Work as a Planter, he says in sections 8 through 10, if therefore anyone wishes to escape from the differences of this question which present themselves in the different doubts thus raised, let him speak freely and say that there is nothing in any material of such power as to be able to support his weight of the world, but it is the eternal Torah of the everlasting God, which is the most supporting and firm foundation of the universe. This it is which, being extended from the center of the borders and again from the extremities to the center, runs through the whole unsubdued course of nature, collecting all the parts and binding them firmly together. So he identifies the Torah with the word. For the Father who created them has made it the indissoluble bond of the universe. Very naturally and appropriately, therefore, all earth will not be dissolved by all water which the bosom of the earth contains, nor will fire be extinguished by air, nor again will air be burned up by fire, since the divine Torah establishes itself as a boundary to all these elements, like a vowel among consonants, so that the universe may, as it were, be harmonious in concert with the music expressed by letters, persuasion by its own authority, putting an end to the threatening conflicts of contrary natures. Okay, so the word permeates the universe. The word, the Logos, is in Philo's thinking identical with the Torah itself, and that the Torah, the Logos, the word, the Devar, the Memra, we'll get into all of that in a future study more, permeates the universe and holds it all together and like glue. And let's now move on to our next handout, which is titled Natural Law. And this is our final handout because we're now going to finally get to Philo's main point. For that, we'll read some passages here. First, from Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 13, verse 1. For all men who were ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they were unable, from the good things that are seen, to know him who exists, nor did they recognize the craftsman while paying heed to his works. In other words, what he's saying is that they should have been able to see the image of the Creator embossed on the creation, stamped into the creation, and that the Creator is evident in the creation because the rational mind, logos, permeates the universe. Verse 5, same chapter, Wisdom of Solomon. For from the greatness and beauty of created things comes a corresponding perception of their Creator. Then verses 7 through 9, same chapter. For as they live among his works, they keep searching and they trust in what they see because the things that are seen are beautiful. Yet again, not even they are to be excused, for if they had power to know so much that they could investigate the world, how did they fail to find sooner the Lord of these things? So again, wisdom is teaching that since the image of Elohim is embedded, embossed in the universe, that the Logos permeates the universe and makes the intellect of the universe that was the active cause evident and in the universe, and that people should be able to see that. Romans chapter 1 verse 20, really Romans 1 and 2, all about this topic, but we're only cover so much of this. We're already over an hour in this teaching. Romans 1:20, Revised Standard Version. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. Okay, now having gone through all of this, we've gone through Philo's. Remember now, I said Philo starts out by making a statement at the beginning of On Creation, and then he goes on in the following sections of On Creation to justify his statement. And we're doing the reverse. We started with going through his justification in On Creation, and even building a little better case by looking at some other passages of Tanakh and some other things that Philo said in some of his other works. And in On Creation, but at the beginning of On Creation, in section 3, he says this, talking about Moses and the opening of the Torah. And his exordium, as the creation story is the beginning of the Torah, and his exordium, as I have already said, is most admirable in embracing the creation of the world under the idea that the Torah corresponds to the world and the world to the Torah, for reasons we have been studying for the past hour. Arranges his actions, back up. I've already said in most admirable embracing the of the world under the idea that the Torah corresponds to the world and the world to the Torah, and that a man who is obedient to the Torah, being by so doing a citizen of the world, Greek cosmopolitan, which has not anything to do with the magazine or its modern usage, but it was an important Greek philosophical term, and Paul is deriving from Moses the idea, arranges his actions with reference to the intention of nature, in harmony with which the whole universal world is regulated. And now we can see why, as we've already covered the material that Philo goes on to justify this with. And he's not justifying, this is the basis for the foundational thinking of Stoicism that he's laid out here. And we've seen how he derives it from the Tanakh, from the Old Testament, and from the ancient Hebrews, and especially from Moses. And incidentally, it's the same things, some of the same things that Plato had said. And Now let's look at one other place in Philo as we conclude here. Philo on the Life of Moses, Book 2, Section 48. For he, Moses, was not like any ordinary compiler of history, studying to leave behind him records of ancient transactions as memorials to future ages, for the mere sake of affording pleasure without any advantage. But he traced back the most ancient events from the beginning of the world, commencing with the creation of the universe, in order to make known two most necessary principles. First, that the same being was the Father and Creator of the world, and likewise the lawgiver of truth. Why? Because the Torah is embedded in the universe. Secondly, that the man who adhered to these laws and clung closely to a connection with and obedience to nature would live in a manner corresponding to the arrangement of the universe, with a perfect harmony and union between his words and his actions, and his actions and his words. Now remember, this word nature that was in Philo on Creation 3, and on the Life of Moses, Book 2, Section 48, in the Hebrew would be teva. From our handout, creation is an impression, which is derived from the very word that's used in Job 38:6 and Proverbs 8:25 that describes the creation in terms of an active cause on a passive subject, as Philo has said, as being stamped or being embossed or pressed into, like pressed into wax. So the nature of the universe is pressed into the universe by the Creator. And so we come to the very ideas that are the foundation of the philosophy of Stoicism, not from Greek philosophy, but from the ancient Hebrews, that there was an active first cause, a rational intelligence, the word, that infused the universe with rational purpose known as providence, and that living in accordance with that natural law is the path to harmony with the universe. Achieving harmony with that rational mind means adopting rational thinking ourselves, and thus aligning our thinking with that rational mind that permeates the universe and is the intent of the universe. Getting in tune with the intent of the universe and therefore the intent of the Creator. Okay, that's the foundation. There's so much more to learn, and we're going to get into so much more in future lessons. But lesson 1 simply is the very foundation of Stoic thought as it is found in the Tanakh. And yes, incidentally, also in the Greek philosophers. But the Greek philosophers either got it because it's universal truths that they observed in the universe, or because, as Eros Nobilis said, they were sneaking a peek at Moses. All right, shalom, everybody, and I hope you'll join me for lesson 2 on Hebraic Stoicism in the near future. Shalom, shalom, everybody.